So welcome. We've got an interesting and exciting program. We will have stories of enterprises around the world tackling poverty. We'll have stories about Tearcraft from RAM, Giramal, and also from Silulo from Cape Town. Thank you, Lavuyo, for turning up and sharing your exciting story with us, and Johnson from Kenya, as well from the Kibera slum in Kenya. So we'll have some of these stories about how enterprises are being used to tackle issues of poverty. And of course, we'll also have bamboo coffins from Bangladesh, from David Howe. Is David here? David, thank you for coming. Is there a special offer if we buy one today? Funeral plan. There you go. So that's the special offer if you want a bamboo coffin and a funeral plan. On top of these stories, we've got a number of funds here, fund managers, Silver Street, working in agriculture in Africa. Omedia, Vinit, thank you for participating today. Dolma in Nepal, and then Novastar in East Africa. But to kick us off, we've got Jim O'Neill. Jim is not in very good shape today because his favorite football club suffered a bad defeat last night, I understand. 2-0, Manchester United, in case you're interested to know. But he's nevertheless made it here. We're glad that you're here. We have a mutual friend, a good mutual friend in Lord Brian Griffiths, who is a great supporter of TBN. And I just found out this morning that we are alumni of this minor league university down in Surrey. And we almost overlap, but in different departments there. So Jim, grateful for you to be here. He's better known for being called Mr. BRIC, I guess. But he's now going to talk about some other new emerging markets that he thinks will be exciting to look at for the coming years. So welcome, Jim.
You got your mic. Yeah. I'm going to be a timekeeper.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction, Kim. I have to say, from a very personal perspective, if the world wasn't complicated enough, as a lifelong Manchester United fan, having watched that abysmal performance last night, I'm not sure if I'm in quite as objective a state as I normally might be. Talk about how the mighty have fallen. I don't know if the remit of what you guys do with your wonderful purpose extends to getting rid of diswanted owners of what were good football clubs, but if any of you here are sympathetic to Manchester United and want to join me on my underlying venture of getting rid of the Glazers, I'll be outside the end at the back of the room for 1 minute when I've finished. So it's very nice to be here, other than the fact it's the morning after that. And I also, what Kim failed to tell you is that he is a Liverpool fan. And I normally make a purpose of saying at these events, if there are any Liverpool fans, can the organisers escort them off the premises before I continue? Because for some reason, despite my worldliness or my pretense at worldliness, I cannot stand anything about Liverpool Football Club. But there you go. Stuart had asked me to talk a little bit about the world in general, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and rattle through a few things about various topical issues, but hopefully relating it to your wonderful underlying purpose of reducing global poverty by giving opportunity and helping opportunity to people in poverty from the emerging world. But I want to connect it to a few different things that are going on. So with no further ado, let me get started. I'm going to try and show you a few pictures to do that. As I start, can I just make sure at the back that you can see this clearly? A few heads nodding, good. So I guess my sort of opening point is reflected in this picture, which is global PMI. For those of you not trained in the miserable world of economics, that is a Purchasing Managers Index, which is produced every month from accumulating a whole series of national ones around the world. And it's probably the most up-to-date monthly piece of evidence about the state of the world economy that exists. It's not perfect, like most economic data, but it's probably the best we have. And as it sort of depicts, the world has sort of been creeping along ever since the disaster of 2008, 2009, sort of attempt to get into the promised land, and then something sort of goes wrong somewhere, and then we make another attempt. And interestingly enough, if you look closer, you can see in the past few months that has been happening again, which is consistent with the mood, particularly in somewhere like the UK, where life seems to be getting better. The second thing, which is highly relevant to the purpose of why you are all here, and raises the challenge, in contrast to much of the previous years before, and especially since 2008, there is a growing mood, at least in the world of finance, that actually the so-called developed world is now doing better, but the big hope for the future, the emerging world, actually is doing worse. And it is quite interesting that as I travel around doing the various things I'm doing in my new life, that mood to me seems to be growing more and more and more. And what was a sort of view that there was some cyclical slowing in some big parts of the emerging world is now sort of, at least in people's minds, translating into a view that actually there's some pretty big structural problems, as there always were in large parts of the emerging world. Which means, obviously for those at the lowest part of the food chain, if that's true, the purposes of why you guys are trying to do what you're trying to do are even bigger than they might have been a year ago, or certainly than people might have thought. And I'll perhaps come back to touch on that towards the end of my comments. The next few pictures just show you this evidence of improving cyclical activity across the developed world. Here's the one for the UK. I just skipped through the US and Europe. It's quite interesting here in the UK. There's sort of a bit of an amusing game going on amongst those who are daft enough to try and forecast GDP, to sort of claim that they're more optimistic than the person they heard yesterday. And there's also this sort of game of people trying to say that, well, the UK is going to be the strongest economy in Europe this year, to which I often tease people and say, well, that's hardly a great claim to fame given the state of the rest of Europe. But indeed, if you look at something like these Purchasing Managers indices, which are pretty accurate by the standards of these things for the next 6 to 9 months, the UK does, for whatever reason, look to be one of the stronger ones. And even much struggled Japan of the past lost at least 2 decades, they are showing some signs of improvement too. This is a so-called Tankan survey that they produce every month. And so, linked to my second point, it is the first time that a large number, or the most number of the so-called developed countries are showing this same cyclical evidence at the same time since 2008. And of course, policymakers and particularly politicians in each of these countries all claim that it's because of some miraculous thing that they're doing to cause this, and it could well be, but I have a suspicion that it actually connects to some common theme which also relates to some part of the emerging world, particularly China, that it's indirectly possibly a consequence of China slowing and the probable related easing of commodity prices. And so for the first time in best part of a decade, we are going through a reasonably sustained period of time where commodity prices are not constantly going upwards. And I think one of the big problems a lot of the so-called developed world and a few developing countries, India one of them, have faced in recent years is on top of the credit crisis, now this perpetual problem of rising food and energy prices too. And I think that was a bigger problem in much of the so-called developed world than people typically acknowledge. And my suspicion is one of the reasons why a lot of the developed world is seemingly doing better is that we may have seen a turn in the commodity cycle. Now, flip side of that, as I'll get into in a few minutes, for large parts of the so-called emerging world, including many of the countries that a lot of you are so deeply involved in, just having chatted with a few of you, to add to the challenges, some of them, of course, are on the flip side of that life seemed to be doing so much better for the past 10 years for many of these, but it indeed quite possibly was the case, and is now becoming perhaps more transparent in some cases that it was. It was primarily because they were having this huge windfall from rising commodity prices, and with commodity prices now turning down, maybe it's not quite the case. Brazil is amongst countries that would fit into that category, Indonesia, and of course, increasingly of relevance, many countries perhaps in Africa too, although I notice in terms of observing how people talk about these things, at the moment, people aren't really reflecting on this so much in Africa. It's more the bigger emerging economies. But if indeed we are seeing this turnaround in commodity prices, then it will be as true for them. The reason why the Global Purchasing Managers Index is sort of just going sideways, despite this improvements in the so-called developed world, is because of the juggernaut otherwise known as China. Which has been slowing for the past 3 years and continues to do so. I'll come back to that picture in a second. Here is a complicated-looking thing. Let me just explain what it is. GSCA stands for Goldman Sachs China Activity Index. I left Goldman Sachs a year ago, in case anybody doesn't realize that. A couple of people I said hello to earlier were saying that they know colleagues of mine at Goldman Sachs, and they didn't seem to realize I'd left there. So I'm compounding that mistake by showing a picture of Goldman Sachs research. This is a proprietary indicator that actually I helped develop in 1998 during the days of the Asian crisis. Because we, like many other people talk about today, didn't trust the quality of Chinese data. I personally don't think it's because they deliberately ever tried or still do try to mislead people. It's just in a place like that is changing at the scale at which China has been and still is, it's pretty difficult for a lot of economic data to be that accurate. After all, it is merely a miserable social science. It is not, Kim, something that you devoted your life to, a proper science. So there is no right or wrong, it's just social science. But anyhow, the long and short of it, if this line's going down, that's the yellow one, it means China is slowing, and if it's going up, it means China is accelerating. The red line is a leading indicator of the yellow one. And I'm concentrating on that because in my judgment, which is sort of my third related issue, is we sort of live in a world that's fundamentally driven by the United States and China. And the rest of us sort of piggyback on the consequences of what's going on in those two places. I could spend hours talking about China, because within that, I believe it's so important, and I don't have the time, but let me just say 3 or 4 additional points. The main reason why, first one, which I think is particularly important, in my judgment, controversially, I think, the main reason why China is slowing down, in contrast to what you read in most parts of the financial media, is because China has deliberately chosen to slow the economy down. It was quite obvious to me, if you look to the crazy period of 2008, 2009, by the end of 2009, the Chinese had realized that they had actually overstimulated their economy to try and rescue it from the consequences of the global credit crisis. I don't have a clicker, but if you look, according to these indicators, for a brief period, Chinese growth, after slowing dramatically to something like, on a quarterly basis, 2%, within a year was back growing close to 20%. And they saw many adverse consequences of that, some of which continue, such as severe pollution, far too much pressure on the use of resources, tremendous problems of urban property prices, etc., etc. And in my judgment, as early as late 2009, the Chinese authorities realized that the benefits of 10% growth were increasingly just being derived by the elite few. And whilst they were lifting, in principle, many people out of poverty, there was a very rapid growing income divide that was basically, at the end of the day, not good for their model of how China should exist, never mind anything else. And as a result of that, they've embarked on a path of what I'd call, and it's my second point really, we're looking at a new China which is all about more quality growth rather than quantity. And the reason why I link this to we live in a world of where we piggyback on the US and China, the winners of the new China and the losers of the new China are probably going to be quite different than the winners and losers of the old China. And if life wasn't complicated enough trying to understand the weird world of economics and finance, that shift, if I'm right, makes it a lot more complicated. And one of the reasons I think a lot of people are struggling to understand the, let's call it short-term dynamics of the world, is because so many people are so used to what I'd call the drug of the old China, they're finding it difficult to adjust to this new China. And perhaps amongst many examples, the best one is this whole issue about commodity prices and many of the companies and countries that have done so well from that. They are not getting that same constant induction of juice from the old China as we had before. And I think it is a big issue for a number of commodity producers, obviously, in the emerging world. But again, to reiterate, as I said earlier, there are a number of countries in the developed world and some in the emerging world that should benefit from this because of the decline in commodity prices. India, for example, which is a significant importer of energy, should be one of the countries that starts to benefit from this. Because if India had already a lot of challenges, it faced a lot of the same problems of rising food and energy prices as much of the developed world. For those of you that might be particularly interested in this, I suspect many of you won't, so I won't dwell on this, but to try to really understand the ongoing shift to this new China from the old China, I follow this every month if I can. It's difficult with Chinese data, but they tend to produce all their data on the same 2 days every month, which adds to people doubting the accuracy of the data because they do it very quickly, and people think, well, how can they do that? I don't know. I don't want to get into that battle, but the China we're looking at in some ways is all about trying to raise the amount they consume relative to the amount they produce. And this is a chart that shows you the relative performance of monthly retail sales, the only available measure of monthly consumer spending, relative to what they produce. And in that sense, I believe for the rest of the world, it's actually really this that we should be more interested in. Does it really matter for the rest of the world what Chinese GDP is? It really should matter what they're consuming and producing. It doesn't really matter to us what their GDP is. And if this line is going up, in my judgment, that's basically a good thing, because that means China is consuming more relative to what it's producing. And if you're consuming more, you're going to be importing more, which means for the rest of the world, instead of living off exporting to the over-leveraged US consumer, which what most business in the world has done most of my lifetime, we can now try to live off the Chinese consumer as well. And even though it's sort of erratic, we're sort of going in the right direction. And there are many complications behind that, which, as I say, I don't have the time to go through to. Linking it all together, before I now jump in to spend the last few minutes before I take some questions in the broader emerging world and some of the specific key issues there. A fourth issue, I would say, that sort of relates to this issue of we sort of live in a world where the US and China drive it, and we all sort of hang on the back of them. A further point I would suggest to you is that in some ways this decade is actually about the US and China swapping places a bit with each other. One way of thinking about the global crisis of 2008-09, or a very simplistic one, but I think one that has a lot of real merits as to why we got into the mess that we did, was the United States saved nothing and financed its over-leveraged consumption and housing boom with the rest of the world's savings. And the opposite side of the coin is China saved idiotically too large amounts of money and didn't really consume much. And amongst the many ways of measuring that would be in their own, each place's balance of payments. The US had this huge and growing current account deficit, and China had this huge and growing current account surplus. And as we go through trying to correct ourselves from that world, you would hope to see some of the opposite happening. So the US consumes less and saves more, smaller current account deficits. China saves less, consumes more, which I just showed you, and a lower current account surplus. And in my judgment, and this is at the core of many things that put me in, generally speaking, a more optimistic place than most people you'll write of, that is happening. Here in in red, ignore the yellow, in red is the current account. CA stands for the Chinese current account surplus as a share of their GDP. And before the crisis, it was actually nearly 10% of GDP. As of the end of last year, it's less than 3%. So the Chinese current account surplus has gone from 10 to 3, which when you next read something about Chinese growth slowing sharply, remember that I said, well, for a place that's cut its current account surplus from 10 to 3 and the growth has only slowed from 10 to 7, that's a pretty good achievement. And in particular, because if you look at the opposite side of the ledger, here's the United States. Went into the global credit crisis with a current account deficit of 6.5% of GDP. And as of the latest data published, it's not full data for all of last year yet. Despite how sophisticated the US is, it's way behind China on producing economic data, which in itself is interesting. Current account deficit less than 3%. People like myself that have studied international economics for the past 40 years used to think it was virtually impossible for the US to have a current account deficit of less than 3% of GDP growth unless it was in permanent recession. As you know, right now, in the world of finance, people think the US is doing better than everywhere else. 2 of the last 3 months have seen the lowest US trade deficits for the past 6 years. The US is coming out of this mess as a somewhat different place than it went into it, which I do not believe is being recognized enough by many commentators. So in that sense, we're in a somewhat better position than we were. I could come back to that, but let me jump forward. So I think I'll spend the rest of my 5 to 10 minutes, so I'll have time for questions, now concentrating on the broader emerging world and where all of you guys are concentrating your efforts. So this is something which I helped a friend of mine put together for a special project for some people in the Middle East just in the past month. And it links to some of the underlying concepts behind why I indeed became known as Mr. BRIC. So what you see in the left-hand table is the largest 15 economies in the world by their GDP and their share of the world. What you see in the right-hand side is the potential state of the world in 2050 in the highly unlikely event that every place achieved its potential at the same time, which, of course, by definition, can't really happen. It would be a pretty miraculous world if it did. Manchester United might not even be owned by the Glazers by then. But for you guys, what is particularly interesting about it is important parts of the so-called emerging world will become potentially the dominant place is in the world. China number 1, India number 3, Brazil number 4, Russia number 6, Indonesia number 7, Mexico number 8, Turkey number 14, Nigeria, that wonderful mad place in Africa, number 15, where I've spent quite a bit of my own life in the past few months. This is not necessarily going to happen. It is their potential. Economic growth over the long term basically depends on two things. My profession loves to complicate it. It makes us sound more important and smart like guys like this. But it ultimately depends on two things. The number of people that work, so the size of the labour force, and the biggest determinant of that is, of course, the demographics, and productivity. If you have a lot of people that work and their productivity improves, you're going to be big. If you have a small number of people, even if your productivity is great, you can't get big. Luxembourg, really prosperous country, but it doesn't have a lot of people, so it's never going to be big. China has the potential to be the biggest economy in the world because it has the most number of people. It's been and continues to urbanize like crazy, and even though they have a lot of problems, in some key areas their productivity is improving a lot. Education being a particularly interesting one. It is, another thing I do in my new life is I'm a non-executive director of the Department of Education here in the UK. This week, the minister responsible for children's education is spending the week in Shanghai trying to learn why they are so good at maths education. Pretty important thing, I would say, for large parts of the rest of the emerging world, actually, as well as for the rest of us. China, and particularly Shanghai, is regarded by the OECD as probably the best city in the world in achieving maths education excellence. And Nigeria has got to do that if it's going to get to this position, amongst many other things. Let me jump forward. I said growth is all about the number of people at work and their productivity. So if you have a lot of people, Nigeria has between 15 to 20% of Africa's population. On some independent estimates, by 2050, it could be the third most populous country in the world, if it manages to stick together as one nation, that is, which is not a given. Indonesia, 240 million people. India, 1.2, etc., etc. These places can do things to boost their productivity. They're going to be big, and there's going to be a large number of people taken out of poverty. GES scores is something else I helped develop at Goldman years ago. It stands for Growth Environment Score. It is an index of 18 different variables that are relative to productivity and sustainable growth. I used to say 10 is the Manchester United of GES scores. 0 is the Liverpool. I guess today I have to say 10 is the Bayern Munich. 0 is the us. It's the Manchester United. Very importantly, for some of you to think about, any people here by any chance from South Korea? South Korea, in my judgment, is possibly the single most interesting country economically of my lifetime. On these scores, South Korea, as you can see, this is the growth environment scores for the 4 BRIC countries and what I call the next 11. These 15 countries are nearly 70% of the world's population. These countries get it right, the world's going to be a better place. South Korea is particularly interesting because its growth environment score, close to 8, is on a list of 180 countries that my old colleagues still do this for. It's the third highest in the world. Now, I say South Korea is the most interesting country of my lifetime because it is the only vaguely large populated country in the emerging world that has taken its wealth to the same level as that of most European G7 countries. South Korea's wealth today is higher than Portugal's. It's nearly the same level as Spain. When I was coming into the world of finance and economics, its wealth was the same as a country in Africa. And so whenever I travel to meet policymakers in Africa, as I frequently do, and they ask me, what do you think you should do? My simple answer is get on a plane, go to Seoul, South Korea, and figure out what they've done, and what bit of it you can use for yourselves, do it. These are the various things for the other places. A couple of other quick comments before I move to the last couple of slides, and I'll stop. I usually get at least one email a day saying to me, when are you going to drop the R in BRIC? Because everybody hates Russia. If it's people that I know, I sometimes jokingly say back, I'll drop it if you let me drop the I for India too. India has got fantastic demographics, but on this stuff, it is easily the weakest. Russia's got a huge number of problems, but it hasn't got as many problems as India. India's growth environment score is easily the lowest of the 4 BRIC countries. And if you look at the shading, in yellow is the change over the past 15 years when we have data to compare all these things. India has improved not only easily the least of the 4 BRIC countries, actually, other than Pakistan, it doesn't compare that well with any of the rest of these places either. Nigeria, second comment to say, even though it's the second lowest of these 15 countries, as you can see, it's actually had a pretty notable improvement. And my way of thinking of those of you involved in doing many of the wonderful things you're doing in Africa and related to Nigeria, the stuff you do helps Nigeria boost this even more. Nigeria is going to take a large number of people out of poverty. These are, and you probably won't be able to see this clearly, and I'm pleased about that, because as soon as people home in on any one number in this table, they say, I don't agree with that number. This is the list of all the different 18 variables that matter. They're split into buckets, 6 different buckets. Top one's arguably the most difficult: corruption, rule of law, political stability. Africa scores, surprise, surprise, particularly lowly on those 3 things. As much as I love Nigeria, the past week, highly disturbing things going on involving the central bank and the president. Won't bore you with the details, happy to expand. You need much stronger governance in many of these places, which, if you can get it, will enable many of these other things to follow. If there are 3 things that I would highlight that South Korea does particularly well at, which indirectly what you guys can do for others can help, it is technology. On a whole range of technology scores, if you go to the bottom, actually Korea scores as well as the United States, if not better. And businesses that you are involved in or thinking of getting involved in that can help many poor people in these parts of the world, Africa, Southern Asia, parts of Latin America, to grow the use of technology for themselves, I think that is a huge thing that South Korea has done for the world. No coincidence that Samsung knocked Apple off its number 1 slot globally. It's because the whole of South Korea is plugged into technology. Education, surprise, surprise, also scores really well. And thirdly, and another important thing for these places, as many Asian countries do, they engage in international trade and foreign direct investments. Here is, you find this even more difficult to see, but I'm sure these slides can be provided to everybody through the organisers. Here are the individual growth environment scores for all different African countries. Many of them are very low, but very encouragingly, quite a lot of them have shown notable improvements in recent years, which gives me great hope that it is not just commodities that have helped a lot of African countries. It's because they are doing some things better for themselves, which I'm sure you guys are helping. And I'll finish off perhaps with this picture, which is another version of what I showed you earlier. This is again looking at the world in 2050, countries that could be more than 1% of GDP from the emerging world. The well-known BRIC countries are on the left, and then there's a whole host of other countries that many people would be surprised to perhaps see on there. But if they can do things involving smart, creative things involving business, which you guys can help them do, these places are going to be a lot bigger, and that is the best way of reducing global poverty. And with that, let me stop. Thank you very much.